In the winter of 1892, as early cold swept through Yellowstone Valley, one small cabin stayed more than 20 degrees warmer than every other home around it, while just a short distance away, water froze beside red-hot stoves and families burned bundle after bundle of firewood, only to wake up to air below 12 degrees inside their homes. All summer long, neighbors had laughed as a Scottish settler built a strange second wall around his cabin, 14 inches out from the logs, and packed with dry straw and peat moss, calling it a useless fence and a waste of good lumber, insisting that one tightly chinked wall was all any man needed. But when north winds came roaring down the valley at over 50 miles an hour, driving snow through every crack and seam of single-wall cabins, dawn after dawn proved something they could no longer deny. The wall they mocked was the reason one home stayed warm while others froze, raising a question no one had bothered to ask before. What did this man understand about wind, still air, and heat loss that everyone else dismissed as foolish excess? The answer did not begin in Montana, or even in that winter, but years earlier on a wind-beaten coast far across the Atlantic. Ewan McKinnon grew up along the coast of Scotland's Isle of Skye, where winters were always harsh enough that any unprepared family paid a price. From childhood he knew a single wall rarely held warmth when cold winds poured down from the north. His father, a crofter, often built fish-drying houses with double planks and a dead air space between to reduce heat loss. As a teenager, Ewan worked summers at an ice house in Portree, where sawdust was packed between double walls to keep things cold through the summer without extra fuel. Those experiences, plus the death of his younger brother in a winter when the old house could not hold warmth, left him with a quiet obsession wherever he lived the home had to withstand extreme cold. When he came to America to homestead, Ewan chose frontier Montana for cheap land and the quiet of Bear Creek Valley. But here the open-range winds from the north came down unobstructed, stronger than anything he had seen in Scotland. At the local general store, he spoke with an elderly Apsaaluk woman who told him how they built winter lodges with double layers of material to create dead airspace between the outside and inside. She said that was what made winter nights bearable. Hearing it, Ewan realized the principle was identical to his father's croft houses, only reversed in purpose. When he raised his 14 times 18-foot log cabin in late June, neighbors assumed he would soon move on to winter preparations like plowing and building barns. His cabin was neat, tightly chinked logs, solid roof, no different from any other homesteader's. But instead of moving on, Ewan raised cedar posts around the cabin 14 inches from the main wall. Seth Brannigan passed by and asked, "What are you doing, Ewan?" Checked his plumb line and replied, "Windbreak wall." Seth snorted, and when Cole Whitmer heard, he laughed loudly, "A fence around the house, waste of effort." But Ewan continued. He nailed 2x4s horizontally between the posts at even intervals to keep the outer frame straight. At the base, he left a drainage gap covered with wire mesh so the fill material would not fall out later. The careful measuring meant the frame took nearly 4 days. Soon word spread through the valley that the Scotsman was building some odd thing around his cabin. As the outer skin took shape, curiosity turned to ridicule. Ewan stood boards vertically from floor to eaves, then capped the edges with narrow strips. At the roofline, he added an overhanging tin-covered extension to carry meltwater away from the cavity. Under the eaves, he left a precise half-inch vent gap for moisture escape. Mrs. Harris rode by, watched a while, and said, "Looks strange, but I guess you have your reasons." Ewan pointed to the gap between the walls and said, "Moving air steals heat. Still air holds heat." To him it was simple, but to locals it was alien. He told her about the Apsaaluk wisdom he had heard, the inner lining in lodges that created dead air space to survive long winter nights. She nodded, but most neighbors paid no mind. From late August into September, while every family focused on harvest and firewood, Ewan spent his time cutting prairie grass and drying it. He built drying racks from scrap lumber, gathered moss from creek bottoms, and spread it thin in the sun until dry and light. He cut the grass short because he needed to fill that trapped air without compacting. He estimated needing over 100 cubic feet of material, all absolutely dry. Seth stopped by again and said, "It'll all rot by Christmas." Whitmer added, "Mice will nest in there. You'll see it was wasted work." Ewan only replied, "If vented right, it stays dry." By October, the ridicule was daily. They said he was wasteful using thousands of board feet for a non-load-bearing outer layer. They said he was foolish because everyone knew tight chinking and a hot fire were enough. They said he was excessive because no one needed that much dead space between walls. But Ewan worked quietly on. He packed the cavity carefully, tamping straw and moss just enough to hold position but not enough to eliminate air pockets. At the top of each wall section he tacked muslin cloth to keep fill from settling. For windows and doors he hinged the outer boards so they could open for repairs but close to form a windshield. The work took 2 months, far longer than others took to build a cabin. While he was still adjusting vents and door seals in mid-October, they grew more certain they would soon have proof that one good wall beat 2 poor ones. What they did not know was that Ewan understood Montana winter wind. A storm did not just bring cold. It brought pressurized air movement that drove wind through every seam and bled heat faster than a single wall could resist. But an outer skin could take the full force, while the dead air cavity broke the flow and retained warmth. The materials he used had been proven in both Scotland and native experience. The principles were clear. His measurements were consistent. And when the first snow fell on Bear Creek Valley, Ewan's cabin was finished, ready to prove what neighbors saw as the stubborn notion of an overly persistent immigrant. By late October, when a thin snow cover still melted daily, the northern sky suddenly turned deep gray, signaling something unusual. A Canadian cold front swept down the Yellowstone Valley faster than anyone expected. Morning winds were brisk by noon, they were howling gusts hugging the ground, and by dusk the valley was lost in thick snowfall. Snow fell non-stop for 24 hours, drumming roofs, wrapping windows, filling every gap, and temperatures plunged so fast that many were unprepared when their breath grew heavy. It was cold Bear Creek had never seen in early autumn. The single-wall cabins immediately faced brutal assault. At the Harris home, water in the bucket beside the stove formed a thin ice skin in hours, alarming the family. Mrs. Harris sat near the fire, yet could not get warm, coughing harshly whenever wind seeped through, chinking despite Mr. Harris stuffing more moss and clay into cracks. By midnight they burned old chairs and tables to keep flames alive, but warmth escaped faster than they could produce it. At the Whitmers, children's lips turned purple, and they shivered uncontrollably. Each breath produced thick white clouds visible feet away. Cole fed the fire constantly, throwing in wood so fast he felt cold again before warmth arrived. The stove glowed red, yet the room stayed icy as a stone cellar. Cabin walls radiated cold. Leaning against one brought sharp pain. Worst was Seth Brannigan's place. He had trusted years of mountain experience to handle an early blow and only moderately sealed gaps with clay. When the storm hit, gusts drove through, overlooked spots, straight into the sleeping area. Seth burned wood twice as fast as normal, feeding large chunks constantly, but cold air soon sucked the heat away. He watched his 2 children huddled in blankets, hands turning blue, and felt real panic for the first time. In many other cabins, the scene was similar. Elders coughed and struggled to breathe. Children cried weakly from cold. Women huddled near stoves, sharing remaining warmth. In places, wind rattled windows so hard, people feared they would shatter. Some tried hanging extra blankets over windows, but wind still found invisible paths. Their greatest fear was not the snow, but helplessness as firewood piles dwindled twice as fast as normal while indoor temperature refused to rise. Bear Creek had never known a moment when every cabin felt like a freezing wooden box. At Ewan's cabin, everything was the opposite. Though snow covered the outer wall and wind howled continuously along the hillsides, interior temperature stayed steady around plus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Water in the bucket did not freeze. Even farthest from the stove, it was only slightly chilly, never biting. His breath did not form thick frost near the door, proving indoor air held stable warmth. The double-wall neighbors had mocked took the full wind force, while the dead air cavity retained all stove heat. His modest fire, rarely fed, maintained minimum comfort. Occasionally he checked outer hinges and wind curtains, finding everything sound. Ewan knew his cabin performed exactly as summer tests predicted, but when he peered through thick snow at faint flickering lights from other cabins like dying embers, he knew what neighbors had not yet grasped: this storm, however fierce, was only the beginning. Early season winds were rarely the cruelest. What came in the next weeks would be the true test, and if single-wall cabins already struggled through one night, the next cold waves would be far harsher. The morning after the first storm, while the valley remained buried in snow and single-wall cabins still fought to retain scant warmth, Ewan quietly opened his leather journal and began recording numbers he had tracked since construction. Each morning he measured outdoor and indoor temperature with an old mercury thermometer brought from Scotland. Last night outside hit -12, while inside held around +10. That 22-degree difference was no accident, but the steady result of prior days' readings. He wrote, Outside -12. Inside +10. Difference stable. To him it was simple proof that the principle his father taught and the Apsaluk woman described fit Montana's climate perfectly. To neighbors, those numbers would seem unbelievable until seen firsthand. As he expected, by mid-morning, Seth Brannigan appeared at the door looking like a man who had endured a rough night. His thick coat was iced around the collar. His breath came in heavy white bursts. Without waiting for invitation, Seth stepped in and froze. He scanned the cabin, as if what he saw contradicted his own night. "How is it not cold in here?" he asked, voice hoarse but clearly surprised. Ewan replied, "Outer wall takes the wind. Cavity holds still air." Seth reached toward the inner wall and did not flinch from cold as he did touching his own. He crouched near the floor, stood, tilted his head, listening. "No wind noise," he said softly, almost to himself. Then he moved to the outer door, cracked it slightly. Wind rushed in but only reached the outer boards. No howling pierced the inner wall. No wind running through, Seth muttered, eyes widening. He pulled a wooden pipe from his pocket, lit it, and took a draw. When he opened the outer door a few more inches, pipe smoke was immediately sucked hard toward the outer skin, swirling along the boards. But when he stepped near the inner wall and exhaled smoke into the room, it hung, drifted slowly, and dispersed evenly, as if the cabin felt no wind influence. He tried twice more, same result. "Impossible," Seth whispered. Anyone watching would have seen the man who once loudly mocked Ewan stand motionless for dozens of seconds, pipe forgotten. When he turned back to Ewan, the usual stubborn skepticism was gone. "You mean, just still air?" Ewan nodded. "Wind steals heat faster than you think. But if you break the wind force before it hits the main wall, you only need to keep warmth from being sucked out." Seth was silent a long time, clearly rearranging years of belief in proper cabin building. Then he asked, "And the packing between walls," Ewan answered, "holds the air still. Moving air loses heat. Still air retains it." Seth scanned the cabin again, searching for flaws in the theory, but found none. The entire room was living proof. Breath did not frost. Bucket water did not freeze. Space stayed comfortable with a small fire. When Seth stepped out to head home, cold wind slapped his face, making him pull his collar tight, and that moment sharpened the profound difference between his world and Ewan's cabin. Word of Seth's visit spread as fast as the wind tearing through Bear Creek. Some said Seth was convinced, others that he could not argue with what he saw. Though opinions varied, one thing began to waver in their minds. Perhaps, just perhaps, what they had laughed at for months was not madness. As Ewan latched his door and added a few lines to his journal, he knew the first crack of doubt had appeared in the community, and winter had not truly begun. Days after the first storm passed under heavy caution across the valley, but early the following week, an odd sign made Ewan freeze on his porch. Wind suddenly stopped completely for 6 straight hours. No branch stirred, no familiar Bear Creek whistle, only heavy silence blanketing the ground. The western sky turned dull copper red, a color he had seen only twice in Scotland before the worst low-pressure storms. Ewan called Seth and Harris to warn that the next storm would be unlike the last, but they brushed it off, saying, "Early season is always like this. First blow is the worst. It can't get worse." Ewan watched them leave without further argument, but inside he knew anyone believing that would pay dearly. At sunset, the sky collapsed as if pulled by enormous weight. The first wind arrived with a long roar, then rose to face stinging blasts. Within 3 hours, gusts hit 55 miles an hour and temperature dropped to -30. Snow no longer fell gently, but was hurled in large sheets, slamming cabin walls and exploding into fine dust. Each gust struck walls with heavy thudding sounds, as if someone hammered every board. From the Whitmer and Harris areas came repeated cracking of wood mixed with children's terrified cries from cold. At the Whitmer cabin, chinking, reinforced after the prior storm, tore open in hours. Wind drove in waves, making indoor air so cold that every child's breath instantly formed ice crystals on hair and scarves. Though Cole tried stuffing more cloth into cracks, wind yanked everything loose, leaving them nearly trapped in a wooden box full of icy blasts hitting their faces. The Harris place was worse. When outside pressure dropped fast, their window glass rattled violently, then shattered, letting a direct cold blast rush in like a punch. "Mrs." Harris began coughing violently soon after each breath, ragged as freezing air filled her lungs. "Mr." Harris frantically burned everything available, old barrels, chair legs, spare boards, but flames flickered under constant wind suction. Shattered glass clinked in the wind like warnings. At Brannigan's, Seth used 2 days' firewood in one evening, feeding flames so fast he had to run into the storm for more, a dangerously desperate act he felt forced into. Returning wind nearly ripped his coat away, and minutes later cabin warmth was sucked out again. The 2 children, wrapped tight in blankets, still shook uncontrollably. Their thick breath clouds signaled dangerous body heat loss. In scattered valley cabins, livestock lowed weakly before collapsing. Cattle fell in stalls from sudden cold and wind force. Wall packing blew out roofs, shuddered under wind roar. Some families discussed leaving cabins mid-storm for other shelter, a choice that could kill them within hundreds of steps, as early winter wind could paralyze a healthy person in minutes. Ewan stood inside his cabin, hearing the storm batter the outer wall, but feeling no penetrating cold reach the inner wall. Though his stove burned low, indoor air remained bearable. He looked through frosted glass and saw shadowy figures running in wind, panicked and desperate. In that moment, he understood his earlier prediction. Without someone guiding them to safety, valley residents could die inside their own cabins before dawn. While Ewan listened to the storm tearing at the outer wall to gauge the night's danger, a weak knock sounded amid howling wind. He opened immediately and found Mr. Harris staggering on the porch, snow-covered, carrying Mrs. Harris pressed against his chest like a frozen log. Her face was pale, lips nearly colorless, breath shallow from cold. Without questions, Ewan pulled them inside, shut the door tight, draped a wool blanket over Mrs. Harris, and set her near the stove. Mr. Harris collapsed beside her, hands still trembling from fighting wind, while Ewan quickly fetched more blankets and dry woolens. As Mrs. Harris began shivering again, he knew her body was recovering from the room's steady warmth. Minutes later, another knock came, stronger but halting. Seth Brannigan appeared with his 2 small children, pressed close, faces red from cold, lips blue. He tried a forced smile at Ewan, but his eyes showed he was near his limit. Ewan brought all 3 inside, wrapped the children in blankets, and gently rubbed their hands to restore circulation. Seth dropped 2 bundles, nearly collapsing from exhaustion as melting snow dripped from his frozen hair. Less than half an hour later, the entire Whitmer family arrived, dragging a sack containing only a few firewood scraps, some hardtack, and rags. Cole Whitmer leaned on the wall just inside to catch his breath. His eyes scanning the warm cabin lacked the earlier mockery when he watched Ewan build double walls. Gradually, the small 14 times 18-foot cabin filled. 11 people crowded the space, yet indoor temperature held between +12 and +14 degrees. Water in the bucket against the wall did not freeze, a fact no one had believed when Ewan mentioned it before. Even those fresh from bone-chilling cold outside could not hide amazement at warmth spreading evenly, despite a moderate stove fire. Once everyone settled, Ewan checked the main door and floor gaps. He noticed each entry let a small amount of wind reach the inner wall. Though the cabin still held heat well with so many people and rising wind, he knew reinforcement was needed. He hung old wool curtains along the inner door to create a simple airlock. Then he stuffed dry grass into small floor gaps and wrapped cloth around hinges to reduce vibration. Minutes later, wind infiltration dropped sharply. Indoor air stabilized and warmed further. The floor near the door rose 3 degrees. Children who arrived, shaking teeth, chattering, gradually relaxed shoulders, and sat close, telling weak but less trembling stories. One Whitmer girl even held her hands near the stove to test numbness, smiling faintly as warmth returned to her skin. The cabin fell into strange silence. Silence from exhaustion, fear, lingering cold, but most of all, silence from realizing what they had tried to deny. No one mentioned Ewan's stubbornness or oddity. No one mocked the second wall. They only looked at him with gratitude mixed with respect and emotion, a simple nod conveyed fully. Months of ridicule vanished as fast as wind whipped snow outside. In that storm night cabin, they knew that without the structure they once called laughable, many might not have reached Ewan's door alive. And in that moment, as Ewan added wood and watched everyone begin recovering, he understood this night marked a turning point between him and all of Bear Creek Valley. Once everyone had recovered somewhat, Ewan looked around and knew that temporary shelter here could get them through one night, but if the storm lasted 3 or 4 more days as he predicted, single-wall cabins outside would not hold. He stated clearly that without immediate reinforcement, cold would kill them not in days, but after one failure night. Hearing this, everyone panicked. Going outside in wind that seemed to tear flesh was unthinkable, especially for those nearly lost to cold. But Ewan calmed them with a step-by-step plan, assigning tasks in the shortest possible time. Who would go out, who would prepare materials, who would tend fire inside. He explained they need not build a full complex double wall, like his only a temporary shield following the principle enough to break wind force and retain dead air space. Once the cabin agreed, Ewan began guiding temporary double wall construction. He pointed out ideal spacing between auxiliary wall and cabin, 8 to 12 inches depending on available material. He told them to use rough boards, old barn posts, or any standing planks for an outer windshield. Then the cavity must be packed with light material, dry straw, wild grass, rags, old burlap, anything non-absorbent that trapped still air. Finally, he instructed hanging thick wool blankets or cloth on the inside to reduce moving air, cutting convection and stabilizing heat. With the crowded cabin, not everyone could go out, so Seth and Cole volunteered with Ewan for the hardest part. They wrapped scarves around faces, pulled coats tight, and burst into wind. Snow instantly pelted them like hard grains, stinging eyes and burning skin. Ewan led crouching to reduce chest wind force, while Seth and Cole struggled to hold long boards the wind tried to rip away. Each post driven into ground shook as wind slammed boards, forcing them to lean full body weight to hold. Hands went numb, often feeling gone, but they continued. After erecting a few boards, they returned inside for more dry straw and burlap to stuff cavities. Wind scattered grass and straw, but light tamping settled the material gradually, forming crude but effective insulation. Hanging thick blankets inside was hard too. Each gust lifted edges, but Ewan patiently secured every point and corner until the final shield was fastened. They worked hours without rest. Wind pierced clothing, freezing lips numb, but they finished before full dark. When temporary walls were done and they shut the door, immediate indoor warmth proved every effort worthwhile. Wind infiltration dropped noticeably, and though the storm still raged outside, cabins no longer shook as violently. Over the next 2 days, temporary walls reached maximum effect. Reinforced cabin temperatures rose 10 to 16 degrees higher than before. Bucket water stopped freezing, and those coughing harshly from cold now only breathed heavily. No one could believe hastily erected straw and rough boards saved them from such deadly cold. Those who once mocked Ewan now looked at him entirely differently. Community belief shifted markedly. They no longer saw him as stubborn with strange ideas, but as the person who understood wind, land, and cold better than anyone in the valley. Ewan said nothing about it, but as he added lines to his journal, he knew Bear Creek would never again call double walls a joke. As temporary walls began working and warmth in each home stabilized, early storm panic faded, replaced by thoughtful silence. On the first clear morning after nights of howling wind, Seth stood long before Ewan's cabin before knocking. His face remained haggard from lack of sleep, but eyes lacked usual stubbornness. When Ewan opened, Seth drew a breath and said in a hoarse but firm voice, "We were wrong from the start." Ewan looked at him a moment, then shook his head lightly. No one was wrong. Just hadn't come time to understand yet. That simple statement made Seth bow his head as if a burden lifted. From that moment, the valley seemed to shift. Those who once avoided Ewan's cabin, fearing they would appear weak now, sought him out for advice. Cole Whitmer brought an old notebook asking ideal spacing between walls and why Ewan chose 14 inches rather than less or more. The Harris family asked about straw and moss compaction, wondering why Ewan did not pack tight to save material. Others asked about eaves, moisture vents, wire mesh at the base, half-inch roofline gap for air escape. Questions poured out as if long-held certainties had been blown away by wind, leaving a void they now filled with new understanding. What amazed them most was Ewan showed no arrogance or need to prove himself right. He explained each principle in calm, gentle tones, like someone who had endured too much cold to care who was right or wrong, only wanting everyone to know how to protect themselves. He spoke of pressure differences, how wind not only chilled but sucked heat from walls, how porous material trapped still air, the dead airspace, he repeated, as winter survival's core. Martha, the valley teacher, sat in a corner, recording every word and measurement. She noted post-spacing board thickness, straw dryness after sun exposure, even small notes like muslin cloth at wall tops to prevent fill settling. She said one day these notes might become official guidance for Montana homesteaders. Local doctor, Mr. Rourke, after checking everyone's health, examined the cabin himself and could not hide astonishment. He said if field medical stations used this double-wall model, winter pneumonia cases could drop significantly. A cabin holding a few extra degrees can save an elderly life, he said, and everyone present knew it was no exaggeration. As understanding spread, the valley began changing itself. Though no family could immediately build a full permanent double wall like Ewan's, they applied core principles to their own repairs. The Whitmers packed cavities with shredded grass and old wool mixture. The Harrises used bark, dry leaves, and gathered burlap. Seth decided to add windshields from old barn boards. Though materials varied, all followed Ewan's lesson: one wall to take wind, one wall to live in, dead air space to survive. Each realized the lesson was not just technique, but hard-won survival knowledge, nearly lost to old habits and blind confidence. And looking back at recent storm nights, cold now gone from bodies but memories intact, they understood that changed awareness itself had kept them alive. When the storm finally cleared and Yellowstone Valley returned to quiet, misty mornings, Ewan compiled all data from his journal kept through both storms. Neat, slanted lines recorded every 6 a.m. showed a clearer picture than any telling temperature difference between outer and inner walls, consistently 18 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of wind strength. Each night his cabin used roughly 40% less firewood than surrounding single-wall cabins, confirmed by his remaining stock versus neighbors' depleted piles. Ewan organized data into categories: penciled marks, wind speed, firewood consumed, heat retention, time, fill, material thickness. He did not record to prove himself right, but felt almost a duty to leave evidence for those facing future winters. Meanwhile, Martha, whose habit was recording school events, crops, and weather for the Territorial Education Office, conducted independent measurements. She brought 2 mercury thermometers, a long wooden rule, and a fresh notebook. She measured pre-dawn temperatures at 3 different cabins, noting bucket water, freezing wall condensation time each home took to burn a standard firewood bundle. Then she repeated identical measurements at Ewan's cabin. Differences were so stark she remeasured 3 times to ensure no error. In her report to the Montana Education Office, Martha wrote that the double-wall cabin model has practical value in high-wind environments, contributing to resident health protection in cold regions. That report later passed hand-to-hand at town meetings as official documentation of that winter. Community response came faster than Ewan expected. Residents from farms 4 to 5 miles away visited many with paper and pencil, asking him to sketch the simplest design they could follow. Some called his cabin that winter's symbol not because it was prettier or larger, but because it stood firm when all others faltered. Those who once mocked him now listened most intently, and no one mentioned past ridicule. They had seen firsthand the difference between surviving and nearly freezing to death, and knew Ewan's journal numbers were not theory, but survival proof. The story spread beyond the valley faster than anticipated. A merchant from Billings, seeking better warehouse insulation for perishable goods, heard of double walls and rode out to see. He walked around the cabin, touched boards, asked detailed questions about wall spacing and moss type. Before leaving, he said if the method worked for goods, he would pay Ewan to guide his carpenters in building a similar model. Rumors traveled further to the army post near the main road. A young sergeant visited, saying winter barracks often suffered wind infiltration, causing respiratory illness, and his superiors wanted to know if the structure could apply to winter supply storage. As he took notes, his wind-cracked hands trembled, and Ewan realized knowledge once meant only to protect one small cabin had crossed valley boundaries, becoming something that could change how people survived frontier winters. 1 year later, when new winter again swept Yellowstone Valley, the scene before Ewan differed vastly from the previous storm season. Where once only desperate single-wall cabins faced cold winds, now 6 new cabins stood, finished with double walls and versions each family adapted. Some kept Ewan's recommended 14-inch spacing, but others expanded to 16 or even 18 inches for thicker insulation fill. A few experimented with moss straw and crushed bark mixtures to improve still air trapping. Those improvements came not from expert advice, but from last winter's life or death experience, and from evenings gathered at Ewan's cabin, exchanging ideas, testing, and recording what worked best. The change's impact went beyond numbers, Dr. Rourke recorded. Valley children almost never suffered prolonged colds or mild pneumonia as in prior years. The doctor said his winter visits dropped markedly, especially in coldest months. The elderly, most vulnerable to frontier wind chill, fared far better. Mrs. Harris, who nearly died in the first storm, now sat by her window, reading without 3 blanket layers. Old farmer Mr. McDonnell at Valley Edge said for the first time in 20 years he did not sleep beside the stove for warmth. Even livestock benefited. Many barns, upgraded to double-wall models, helped cattle, goats, and horses survive storm nights that once claimed them from cold or exhaustion. Just 1 extra wall saved our whole cattle season, Cole said, and no one disputed it. But perhaps the deepest change was not architecture or health, but relationships once divided by doubt and pride. Before that storm, the valley split into small cliques. One household avoided another. People mocked others' ideas. Everyone guarded ego like a shield. Now it was different. They shared materials, helped raise outer frames, checked one another's moisture vents and straw packing. When one cabin lacked proper finish, others arrived unasked to help. Ewan, once labeled the eccentric double house builder, now received genuine respect, yet he still lived quietly in his small cabin, chopping wood alone, drying moss on racks as before. He sought no fame, no mention at town meetings. For him, valley winter survival was the only reward. And each time he saw new double walls rising, he knew last year's lesson had not blown away with the storm. It had become part of the valley, part of the community, part of how people here learned to live with harsh winter. The double wall method's spread did not stop at Yellowstone Valley, but continued beyond Montana borders as farm newspapers began publishing the story. The following spring, the Dakota Farmer first ran an article titled "The McKinnon Double Wall Method," complete with a clear diagram showing each layer: outer wind-catching wall, dead air, cavity, fill material, inner heat-retaining wall. The piece detailed every construction step from post spacing and material compaction to Ewan's moisture vents and eaves ventilation. Soon afterward, Montana Homesteader published a longer technical analysis for rural readers, calling it the decade's most practical improvement. Those articles passed hand to hand across farms, pinned on general store walls, and became town meeting topics, something unimaginable a year earlier for an idea from a man once deemed eccentric. Attention eventually reached territorial Montana authorities. A county official was sent to survey Ewan's cabin firsthand. He arrived with clipboard measuring tape and long technical question list. Stepping inside, he immediately noticed temperature and wind infiltration differences from other cabins inspected. Ewan, as usual, used no fancy words. He lit his pipe, drew deeply, then blew smoke toward the outer wall. Smoke was sharply sucked along natural board gaps in the sacrificial skin, swirling and vanishing. When he tried the same at the inner wall, smoke barely moved. "That's all," Ewan said, wind held by the outer inner lives in quiet. The official stood silent a long while, then nodded and filled over half a page with notes. Before leaving, he said the method should become official recommendation for cold settlement regions. But the latest recognition came from those who once mocked Ewan most. One June afternoon, while gathering next season's hay, Seth brought a small, worn envelope. Inside was clumsy handwriting from those who laughed at him. "Without you, our families would not have survived that winter." The Harrises sent thanks and apology for once calling his work madness. Even Cole Whitmer, who once declared face-to-face one good wall beats two empty ones, now left a basket of apples at the cabin door as wordless acknowledgement. But what moved Ewan most was the story Seth told his son and daughter. One early summer evening by dying campfire, Seth said to them, "Listen to those who are different, sometimes they save your life." Those words spread through the valley not as moral lecture but as witnessed truth. And Ewan, ever humble, understood the double wall technique was no longer just one craftsman's insight, but part of community legacy, a lesson in survival, persistence, and change that sometimes only a brutal winter can forge. The next winter blanketed Yellowstone Valley with early heavy snow, and Ewan stood before his cabin, looking down the valley, where new double wall cabins stood, sturdy like modest but resolute forts against western winds. Every board, every dead air space, every reinforced eave bore traces of the winter of 1892, the winter that forever changed the entire community. As morning mist cleared, Ewan heard children's laughter echoing from the Harris place, children who once shivered blue-lipped in that storm now running playfully around the yard as if they had never known bone-deep cold fear. Mrs. Harris sat on her porch, wrapped in wool, telling the children the story. The whole valley now treated as legend. The winter Ewan built double walls. The winter people learned humility before wind, and learned to listen to what they once mocked. In the gloomiest late afternoon hour, Martha appeared on the trail to the cabin, still carrying her notebook as always. As they stood side by side, gazing at snow-dusted cabin roofs, Ewan said softly, almost only for the wind, "I just didn't want to see anyone else lost to the cold." Martha smiled, eyes slightly teary, understanding it was not the statement of someone seeking credit but of one who had seen too much pain swallowed by winter wind. The legacy Ewan left was not articles or complex blueprints, but change absorbed into every home, every habit, every elder's tale told on long, early winter nights. Valley elders told grandchildren that the winter of 1892 was when they nearly lost everything, and also when they learned the value of persistence, of not quitting just because mocked, of daring to see beyond the obvious. Now, whenever strong wind gusts through the valley, double walls not only warm families inside but remind that a community once stood on the edge of life and death and chose change. And the most beautiful irony, what everyone once ridiculed became what saved them. Old mockery vanished with the wind, leaving only sturdy homes and grateful people saved by what they once called folly. That winter afternoon, as snow began falling again and children's playful voices still echoed over cold ground, Ewan understood that sometimes an extra wall is not just against wind, but against human stubbornness, clearing the way for what every community needs to endure: the ability to change, learn, and stand together against life's harsh winters. Thank you for joining the story. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring timeless stories.